December 17th, 1944. Le Glaise, Belgium. A frozen dawn pressed itself over the Ardennes like an iron hand, muffling sound, swallowing breath, and sharpening every echo of war that dared to break the silence. Snow drifted in thin, wind-tossed ribbons across the forest floor, dusting the hulks of German tanks that crouched beneath the trees like steel predators waiting for the command to strike. Inside his command vehicle, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper leaned over a map spread across a metal table bolted to the hull. His black-gloved finger traced the narrow roads twisting between American positions and the fuel depots they guarded. His breath fogged in the frigid air, gathering on the steel walls of the half-track. The engine idled low, a deep mechanical growl beneath his boots. The offensive, Hitler's last gamble, had begun just a day earlier. And Peiper, commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, had been placed at its spearhead. Outside, mechanics hammered shut an engine panel on a Panzer IV, their tools cracking in the cold. A few meters away, a group of young SS grenadiers huddled around a single lantern, their faces pale, helmets rimmed with frost. They whispered among themselves about rumors, surprise attacks, American collapse, and the roads ahead being littered with abandoned enemy vehicles. But Peiper knew better. He had seen the muddy, narrow roads. He had watched tanks struggle up slopes already turning to ice. He knew fuel reserves were dangerously low. His spearhead force, armored, fast, lethal, could cut deep into American lines only if they captured fuel along the way, and that meant speed. A radio operator turned toward him. Herr Obersturmbannführer, reconnaissance reports American armor retreating east of Honsfeld. Their supply trucks, abandoned. Peiper's eyes sharpened. Fuel. Prepare to move, he ordered. We strike immediately. The roads won't stay open forever. He stepped out of the half-track. The cold hit him like a slap, biting through his leather coat. Snow crunched beneath his polished boots as he walked past rows of Panthers, their long-barreled 75mm guns pointed toward the forest's edge like hungry spears. Tank commanders saluted sharply from their cupolas, steam rising from the engines as crews completed last-second checks. Peiper climbed atop his lead Panther AUSF, its armor coated in a thin frosting of ice. He peered through the tree line as the sky began turning from pitch black to the faintest washed-out grey. Somewhere out there were American supply depots, poorly defended, hastily abandoned, and full of the one element his tanks needed more than ammunition. He gave the signal. 15 minutes later, the spearhead surged out of the tree line like a pack of wolves released from a cage. Panthers roared forward, their engines coughing smoke. Half-tracks dragged infantry behind them, boots thudding against metal floors. Machine gunners scanned the snowy slopes for movement. Every soldier felt the same pressure. Move fast, strike hard, never slow, because slowing meant running dry, and a tank without fuel was nothing more than a giant steel coffin. The Germans swept through the first American position like a sudden storm. Snow erupted beneath tank tracks as Panthers smashed through the outer fences. American MPs shouted, scrambling for cover, but they were overwhelmed within minutes. Trucks still idled behind buildings, their engines warm, their drivers nowhere to be seen, likely fled in panic. Peiper's men seized fuel trucks, jerry cans and barrels stacked 3 deep. Mechanics moved like madmen, filling tanks where they stood, sloshing gasoline across armor plates until the air stank with its sharp chemical bite. Peiper watched from atop his Panther. He should have felt triumphant. This was exactly what the plan demanded. Fast advance, American collapse, German armor driving all the way to the Meuse. Yet, as he surveyed the depot, a strange unease began to grip him. These trucks, these supplies, they were only the outer layer of the American line, just forward depots, just the scraps left behind. What he saw here was only the first hint of something he had not been prepared to face, the scale of American supply. And as the fuel trucks emptied into his hungry tanks, he could already sense it. This victory felt too small, too incomplete, too fragile. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. December 17th, 1944. Late morning. The armoured column rumbled westward, engines revving hard against the cold wind that scoured the forest roads. Frost-covered branches slapped against the sides of half-tracks as the column pushed toward Honsfeld, where American units had retreated in disarray only hours earlier. Peiper's Panther led the advance, its tracks grinding deep grooves into the hard-packed snow. The smell of burned gasoline and exhaust lingered behind them, a reminder of how desperately the tanks were drinking every drop they had taken. Inside the command Panther, Peiper kept his binoculars raised, scanning the rolling white fields. In the distance, thin trails of smoke rose lazily from burning American jeeps abandoned along the roadside. The sight stirred a mix of satisfaction and urgency inside him. Speed, always speed. His radio operator leaned in. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, scouts report a large American convoy halted just ahead. Fuel trucks among them, unsecured." Fuel trucks. Peiper didn't hesitate. "Push forward! Cut them off before they scatter!" The column accelerated. Snow blasted sideways as Panthers churned forward, their engines roaring like beasts awakened from winter slumber. At the front of the formation, SS Grenadiers checked their weapons, Kar-98Ks, MP-40s, MG-42s, knowing the next few minutes would determine whether their advance lived or died. The road curved sharply and opened into a small valley. There, frozen in place like prey caught in headlights, stood a column of American vehicles, deuce-and-a-half trucks, jeeps with windshields frosted over, and behind them 24 fuel trucks lined up neatly along the road. Most had their drivers still inside, unaware of the German spearhead barreling toward them. The chaos erupted instantly. Panthers opened fire, shells blasting apart American jeeps and flipping trucks onto their sides. MG-42s sprayed across the snow-covered ditches as American MPs and supply clerks scrambled for cover, their rifles useless against the sudden armoured assault. Peiper's Grenadiers jumped from their half-tracks, boots thudding into snow. "Hände hoch! Hände hoch!" they shouted as they rounded up stunned American soldiers, many still half asleep or too shocked to resist. Within minutes, resistance collapsed. The fuel trucks stood intact, frozen guardians of the one resource Peiper needed more than victory itself. Mechanics ran forward immediately, popping open caps and beginning the frantic process of siphoning fuel into jerry cans. Men worked with numb fingers, gasoline splashing into the snow like dark stains on a white canvas. Steam rose in thick clouds from tank engines as they drank the captured fuel greedily. Peiper moved among his men, boots crunching through the bloody snow. The prisoners watched him with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. Most had not expected the German advance to be so sudden or so deep. One American sergeant, trembling with cold and adrenaline, muttered under his breath, "Jesus, how the hell did they get this far?" Peiper heard him. He didn't answer, because he had begun asking himself the same question. He turned to survey the valley, and his stomach tightened. There were dozens of fuel trucks here, yes. Enough to keep his Panthers rolling for many more miles. Enough to smash through towns, capture crossings, push toward the Meuse. But what disturbed him was how casually they had been found, how lightly defended, how wastefully, almost carelessly, the Americans had left behind so much fuel. Fuel they seemed able to abandon without hesitation. What army, he wondered, could throw away so many resources and still fight? His imagination began to conjure the answer, and he didn't like what he was seeing. These were not reserves. These were not strategic assets, positioned deep in defended territory. These were simply the supplies left behind in retreat. If the Americans could discard this much, then what were they holding farther back? How many depots fueled this vast front? How many more convoys thundered along roads beyond the next hill? His radio crackled. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, fuel transfer is 70% complete. At this rate, we can resume movement in 20 minutes. 20 minutes, Peiper nodded, but his hands tightened behind his back. The thought began quietly, almost whispering. If this is what the Americans leave behind when they run, how much more do they have when they stand and fight? He looked again at the endless rows of fuel trucks, their silhouettes stark against the snow. And for the first time, a shadow of doubt crept into him. The Reich was throwing its last reserves into this offensive. The Americans were barely trying. December 18th, 1944, early morning. A pale sun fought to rise behind the Ardennes hills as Peiper's column snaked westward, tanks grinding through snow that had grown heavier overnight. The cold had sharpened into something cruel, turning every exposed piece of metal into a surface that burned to the touch. Exhaust smoke drifted like phantom banners above the armored spearhead. Peiper rode atop his Panther again, watching the road ahead. Stavelot lay before them, a river crossing, a vital point on the map, and one of the many stepping stones needed to reach the Meuse. But between his tanks and the town lay a more immediate obstacle. The twisting, narrow roads that could funnel and choke his entire column. The Panther's engine rumbled beneath him, vibrations running through the armor plate into his bones. The machine was powerful, lethal, but infuriatingly hungry. Every kilometer consumed fuel in mouthfuls. Every burst of acceleration drained precious reserves. Even after capturing 50,000 gallons, the truth gnawed at him. It still wasn't enough. Not for the distances they needed. Not for the roads they faced. Not for the scale of the enemy's supply lines. A crackle on the radio broke the monotony. Enemy roadblocks ahead. Stavelot defenses sighted. Peiper lowered his binoculars. In the valley ahead, black smoke rose from the chimneys of the little town, and the faint rattle of small arms fire echoed against the hills. American engineers had blown barricades across the main road, and infantry were already taking positions in the upper floors of houses. The Panthers rolled to a halt. Peiper dropped down from his tank and stepped through the snow toward the forward infantry officers. The wind carried the sharp smell of pine and burning fuel from distant wrecks. "We break through quickly," Peiper said, his voice curt. "If we slow here, the entire offensive slows with us." The officers nodded, though concern lingered on their faces. The town's narrow streets were a nightmare for tanks, tight corners, stone walls, and hidden approaches that turned armor into trapped beasts. But the order was unquestionable. The assault began with a thunderous barrage. Panthers fired high-explosive shells into the first row of buildings, blowing open facades in bursts of flame and flying brick. MG-42 teams scrambled forward, spraying the windows where American riflemen had been spotted. Half-tracks lurched into motion, carrying grenadiers who fanned out along the roadside ditches. The river crossing was everything. American machine guns answered from across the bridge, their tracers stitching red lines above the snow. A Sherman hidden behind a stone barn fired a shell that slammed into the glacis plate of the lead Panther, rocking it but failing to penetrate. The Panther's gun traversed, fired, and silenced the Sherman in a single glowing flash. Grenadiers rushed the bridge under covering fire, grenades exploding in bursts of white smoke. Peiper watched them push forward relentlessly, faces contorted with cold and adrenaline, as they cleared obstacles piece by piece. The Americans fought with desperate determination, but they were too few, too lightly reinforced, too fragile compared to the iron fist thrown at them. 30 minutes later, German troops secured the bridge, but securing was not winning. When Peiper crossed the bridge himself, stepping carefully over shattered planks and smoking beams, he noticed something the battle had revealed, and it chilled him more than the winter wind. Parked behind the American defensive line, partially camouflaged, were more fuel trucks, not abandoned, full. Their engines were cold, their tires clean, their tanks untouched. The Americans hadn't run out of fuel here. They hadn't even begun to draw from these reserves. They had simply fallen back before overwhelming force. Peiper's men moved to claim the trucks, shouting orders, dragging hoses, preparing once again to drain whatever they could. But Peiper didn't join them. He stood in the middle of the bridge staring at the quiet American trucks with a hollow gaze. This was no victory. This was a revelation. The Americans didn't position these fuel reserves to fight here. They positioned them because they had so many reserves that losing a few didn't matter. They could afford to leave tens of thousands of gallons behind and still field armor across an entire continent. Germany could not. The Reich was bleeding its last drops. The Americans were fighting with overflow. A distant boom echoed from the west. American artillery adjusting range, preparing to retaliate. Peiper didn't flinch, but the truth hit him harder than any shell. The Germans were advancing on borrowed fuel, borrowed time, and borrowed hope. And sooner or later, all of it would run out. December 19th, 1944, dawn. The wind screamed across the high ridgelines west of Stavelot, dragging sheets of ice along the roads like broken glass. Trees bowed under the weight of snow, creaking as though warning the armored column that pushed stubbornly onward. The Panther's engines growled in a low, strained chorus, every machine protesting the cold and the steep climbs. Peiper stood once again atop his command Panther. Frost clung to the edges of his collar, and his breath billowed like smoke from a furnace. His men had fought through 3 towns in 2 days. They had captured more American fuel than any German commander could have hoped for. Yet the arithmetic of war wouldn't change. Fuel burned faster than they captured it. A messenger approached, boots slipping on the icy road. Herr Obersturmbannführer, the advance elements report more abandoned American vehicles near Trois Ponts. Trucks, armor, supply crates. Another cache of treasures. Another handful of miles earned. Another reminder of what lay beneath this offensive. Desperation disguised as momentum. Peiper nodded, but his face remained carved in stone. Order the column forward, secure whatever they left. The messenger saluted and ran back. The Panther lurched to life, and the spearhead crept toward the crossroads. Trois Ponts. The forking of fate. By mid-morning, the grey sky had sunk low enough to brush the treetops, smothering the world in a crushing stillness. As the column approached Trois Ponts, Peiper raised his binoculars. The town was small, little more than a cluster of stone houses and barns. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling lazily into the thick air. But what caught his eye were the shapes glinting along the road beyond the village. Dozens of American supply vehicles, some overturned, some intact, some still loaded with crates stamped U.S. Army, octane fuel, 1944. The year was stamped fresh, the paint barely worn. These supplies had been produced just months ago, shipped across the Atlantic, trucked through France, and driven here, all faster than Germany could scrape together enough gasoline to fill a battalion. Peiper's jaw tightened. His men spread through the village, seizing positions. Grenadiers kicked open the frozen doors of houses, clearing rooms. Mechanics rushed toward the trucks, prying open caps, checking tanks. Then a shout broke the air. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, you must see this!" Peiper leapt down from his tank and followed the mechanic, who waved frantically toward a side road. Snow crunched loudly beneath his boots as he approached. At the end of the narrow lane stood a massive fuel depot, a long earthen-covered structure built beside a railway spur. Its doors were blown open, the interior glowing faintly in the dim light. Inside were rows of fuel drums stacked to the ceiling. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Peiper stepped inside. The smell of gasoline was overpowering. His boots echoed against the concrete floor as he moved deeper into the depot. His gloved hand brushed against one of the barrels, smooth, cold, pristine. He whispered under his breath, not an exclamation, not disbelief, but acknowledgement. "So, this is what we are fighting." A sergeant stepped beside him. "Sir, this is only one depot. There are markings on the crates. This was a forward reserve, a fraction of—" Peiper raised a hand. He didn't need the rest explained. He turned toward the rear doors of the depot, where another detail sent a chill through him more biting than any winter wind. To the west, barely half a kilometer away, lay a rail line, rails bent by frost, but clearly used recently. Snow around the tracks was uneven, trampled by boots and tires. The Americans had been resupplying this area continuously, a steady stream of trains feeding an army that never lacked for anything. Peiper saw it clearly now. The Americans weren't struggling. They weren't scrambling. They weren't fighting the way Germany was fighting. They had infrastructure, not improvisation. Industry, not exhaustion. Reserves, not desperation. This depot wasn't a fortune. It was an afterthought. He imagined what lay behind it. More depots, more trains, more fuel lines stretching all the way to Antwerp, Cherbourg, Normandy. An entire continent of supply feeding an unstoppable machine. Peiper closed his eyes for a brief moment as cold realization settled in his bones. Germany was not fighting an army. Germany was fighting an economy bigger, faster, richer, and immune to the shortages that strangled the Reich. The Panthers outside growled impatiently, their engines idling, their tanks filled with stolen hope. His radio crackled. "American armor sighted to the west. Sherman's moving to block the road." Peiper opened his eyes. The war was still on, but the outcome was no longer a question. He stepped back into the snow, gazing westward as the distant thunder of Sherman engines grew louder. The Americans were coming, not retreating, not collapsing, coming, with fuel to burn. For the first time in the offensive, Peiper felt it with absolute certainty. The Reich could win battles here. But the war was already lost. December 20th, 1944. Afternoon. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets as Peiper's column withdrew toward La Glaise, the village that would become both a refuge and a trap. The once confident advance had slowed to a crawl. The roads were clogged with damaged vehicles, frozen wrecks, and burned-out American trucks still smoldering from yesterday's firefights. But the real enemy wasn't the Americans. It was fuel. Always fuel. Peiper stood atop his Panther, staring down the valley they'd just fought through. Smoke drifted from shattered houses, rising slowly into the grey sky. His men had fought with brutal effectiveness, sweeping aside American defenses and taking ground with the same ferocity that had made Kampfgruppe Peiper the spearhead of the entire offensive. But every kilometre cost more fuel than they captured. Mechanics moved along the line of vehicles, knocking ice from engine guards, checking fuel gauges with grim faces. Even after seizing tens of thousands of gallons, the Panthers were thirsty again, hungry beasts chained by the invisible leash of gasoline. Peiper's second-in-command, Hauptsturmführer Werner Pötschke, approached, his coat flecked with snow. "Sir, tanks report less than half reserves. Some are already running on fumes." "At this rate," Peiper cut him off. "I know." They stood together in silence, listening to the distant thump of artillery. American shells were walking closer along the ridgeline, probing, testing, pushing. Pötschke lowered his voice. "Sir, if we don't secure more fuel, we can't break out. We can't even maneuver." Peiper didn't respond immediately. His eyes drifted toward the west, toward the direction of the Meuse they were supposed to reach. In his mind he saw it again, the endless American depots, the rail lines feeding them, the trucks that filled the roads behind the front like a living river. Germany had sent its last armoured reserves into the Ardennes. America had barely dipped into its first, the ambush at the crossroads. By late afternoon, Peiper's lead elements attempted to push forward, testing the western roads again in search of a breakout route. The snow fell harder now, turning the world into a white blur. At a narrow crossroads just outside Stoumont, an American Sherman fired the first shot. The shell slammed into a German half-track, flipping it on its side. Grenadiers spilled out into the snow, shouting and returning fire blindly into the storm. Panthers roared forward, firing into the tree line where muzzle flashes flickered like ghostly eyes in the blizzard. More Shermans joined the fight, and behind them, fuel trucks, dozens, safe, full, waiting. The tanks weren't fighting alone. They were fighting with infrastructure at their back, an entire logistical ecosystem that the Germans could only envy. Peiper's Panthers destroyed several Shermans, their long 75mm guns punching through American armor with deadly precision. But more Shermans arrived. And more. And more. It wasn't the strength of each tank that mattered. It was the fact that the Americans could replace them, effortlessly. Peiper realized the truth with painful clarity. This battle would not be won with tactics. It would be lost with arithmetic. The Germans fell back toward La Glaise. The fuel runs dry. By nightfall, the column reached the village, if it could still be called a column. Tanks crawled into position like wounded beasts. Vehicles coasted the last few meters on empty tanks. Men shivered beside stalled engines, too exhausted to even curse their luck. Peiper dismounted from his Panther. The engine sputtered once, then died. Around him, other Panthers fell silent one by one, a symphony of machines gasping their last breath. Poetchki approached again, his face pale. "Sir, the fuel is finished. We have nothing left." Peiper looked at him, but his gaze drifted past, toward the snow-covered valley where American armor was already massing again, supplied, refueled, warm, relentless. Behind the Reich's final armored thrust lay no reserves, no depots, no trains, just the last fumes of a dying war machine. He whispered the words only to himself. So this is how it ends, not with defeat in battle, but with emptiness in the tanks. The air vibrated as the Americans began shelling the outskirts of La Glaise. The final encirclement had begun. Peiper turned to his officers. "Prepare defensive positions, and burn anything we cannot carry." If the war was already lost, then this last stand would be made with what they had left: steel, frost, and men, but not fuel, never fuel again. December 22nd, 1944. Night La Glaise lay buried beneath snow and smoke, its stone houses glowing faintly under the orange smear of distant fires. The once quiet village had become an island in a rising American tide. Artillery pounded the outskirts. Sherman engines grumbled in the valleys. Searchlights cut through the falling snow like cold white knives. Inside the village church, where wounded men now filled the pews, Peiper studied a map by the ghostly glow of a lantern. The room smelled of pine, gasoline, blood, and damp wool. Sense of an army near collapse. Outside, mechanics worked in the dark, checking fuel tanks again and again, even though they all knew the truth. There was nothing left to find. Peiper stepped out into the snow. The temperature had dropped again, the cold so sharp it made his breath feel like shards of glass in his lungs. Frost coated the hulls of the Panthers scattered throughout the streets, iron giants frozen in place, their guns pointing uselessly into the night. The men still manned them, refusing to abandon their posts, even though they understood that without fuel, they were no longer tanks. They were bunkers, steel sarcophagi, symbols of a Reich running on whispers instead of gasoline. A young grenadier jogged toward him, boots slipping in the icy slush. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, American armor approaching from the east. We count at least—" A thunderous explosion cut him off as a Sherman shell shattered against a nearby building, spraying the street with chunks of brick and burning debris. The grenadier dove for cover. Peiper didn't flinch. "Hold the eastern line," he said, voice steady, "and send word to all Panthers. Prepare to destroy sensitive equipment." The grenadier swallowed hard and ran. Peiper exhaled slowly, watching the vapor drift upward. In the distance, American tanks continued to advance, firing deliberately, confidently. Their engines never sputtered, never coughed, never died. Fuel did that. Fuel was confidence. Fuel was power. Germany had men who would fight to the last bullet, but America had engines that would run to the last mile. The last decision. By dawn the next day, La Glaise was almost completely surrounded. American infantry closed from the south. Shermans pressed from the north. The air shook with the constant thunder of artillery. Peiper gathered his officers in the church one final time. "We will not waste lives defending machines that cannot move," he said plainly. "We break out tonight. Only those who can march will march. Burn every vehicle." There was no argument. Everyone in the room already knew there was only one choice left. That afternoon, flames rose across the village as the remaining Panthers and half-tracks were set alight. Men stood in silence as their machines, symbols of the Reich's last gamble, burned down to glowing skeletons of steel. The fire crackled, sending sparks drifting into the cold wind. Peiper placed a gloved hand on the side of his command Panther for the last time. The metal was so cold, it bit through the leather. "You carried us farther than you should have," he murmured. Then he stepped back and watched it burn. The breakout and the truth that remained. Under cover of darkness, Peiper led his men in a silent column through the forests northwest of WWII. Snow muffled their footsteps. The trees swallowed their silhouettes. Behind them, the last Panthers of Kampfgruppe Peiper glowed like dying stars. By the time they reached German lines days later, the offensive had already faltered everywhere. The dream of reaching the Meuse had evaporated. The Wehrmacht was falling back on every front. Peiper reported the losses, the men, the vehicles, and the fuel. His superiors spoke of regrouping, rejoining the fight, preparing the next operation, but he knew better. The Reich had launched its final blow using fuel it could not spare, vehicles it could not replace, and hope it could not afford. Meanwhile, the Americans had left behind more fuel than the entire Kampfgruppe consumed. Not because they were careless, but because they could. It was the moment Peiper would never forget. Standing in the snow surrounded by more American fuel than his entire force could burn, and realizing that even if he captured every last drop of it, the Reich still had no chance. Fuel had won the war long before tanks ever fired.